Hello, I am the Mathematician, and welcome to my very first YouTube video. Today, I'm going to talk about what is probably my favorite book that I've read in years. All the Light We Cannot See. This book is so good, guys. Not only was this my favorite book, but I recommended it to a friend, and she liked it enough to recommend it to her father, who apparently rarely, if ever, reads. Well, she told me that he loved it. Now, I do have some suspicions as to why this is the case, and I'm going to talk about that in this video. But first, let me introduce the story. And by the way, I'm going to be avoiding spoilers unless you consider the main premise of a book to be a spoiler. Basically, I'm not going to be telling you anything that I think is going to ruin your enjoyment of the story. At least at the beginning. I'll let you know when it gets into spoiler territory, but I still don't think it'll be enough to warrant you stopping the video if you haven't read this book. The first thing you should know about All the Light is, admittedly, it can be a little bit confusing. This is because it takes place across what is essentially multiple timelines, and there are two different main characters. Not to mention, there are a few themes that come from the perspective of some of the minor characters, and even from what is best described as the antagonist. So, if you're not good at following along with quickly changing perspectives, this may not be the book for you. That being said, the book benefits in that every chapter is extremely short and bite-sized, each one being about 2 to 3 pages long, usually like 5 at the most. And although the writing is very beautiful and even poetic at times, it's definitely not hard to understand. It definitely has some dark subject matter, especially at the end, so I really wouldn't recommend it for a kid audience. A website called The Reading Hub marks it as a PG-13 book, which I'd agree with. There are themes of self-harm, harm of others, and a particularly harrowing scene of SA. Just remember that the book takes place during World War II, and it doesn't shy away from the evils of such a war. If any of these things bother you, you may unfortunately want to skip the book. That being said, aside from the darker themes expressed, I really wouldn't say it's difficult for your average avid middle school reader to understand. The language is simple but effective. And as I said, the short chapters helps to keep the reader from getting bored or impatient as the character and setting is changing at a rapid pace. This is one of the reasons I suspect that so many non-readers have enjoyed the book. Something I found not only in my friends' experience, but also in reading other reviews online. But there is another reason, one that, funnily enough, is also the main criticism of the novel. That is, the story of the Sea of Flames. So, the Sea of Flames is a jewel that is said to be cursed. The story goes that a prince found the diamond in a riverbed somewhere in Borneo. He took it because he thought it was pretty. On his travels back home, he was attacked by some thieves who stole all of his possessions and stabbed him in the heart. However, he had the diamond clutched in his fist, and thus the thieves never saw it and never stole it. After this event, he was somehow able to crawl his way back to his palace, diamond in hand. Once he finally got there, he fell into a coma for 10 days before finally waking up. Due to the miraculous nature of his survival, many of those around him began to believe the diamond, eventually known as the Sea of Flames, was somehow blessed. His story eventually became that as long as he held the diamond, he would live forever. However, there was a catch. The longer he held the diamond, the more misfortunes fell upon those around him. His family and friends began meeting unfortunate circumstances, usually resulting in death, and eventually the Sea of Flames became to be known as cursed. Those who held it would live forever, but at the expense of everybody they're close to. During the events of All the Light, the diamond is kept up locked in the Parisian Museum of Natural History, of which one of our main characters, Marie-Laure, has a father who works there. However, upon the Nazi taking of Paris, the security of this diamond becomes a major problem. Because Hitler yearned for valuables and other material possessions of the world, another aspect of the story which comes from truth, the museum becomes concerned that it will be taken from them. As such, they send the diamond elsewhere, escaping with one of their employees. But not just that, they send multiple decoy diamonds as well, with not even the employees knowing which one has the real thing. As I imagine you might guess, one of those copies comes with Marie-Laure's father. And here is where the antagonist comes from. Von Rumpel, a Nazi who is sent after the Sea of Flames in an attempt to take it. Again, this is the closest the story gets to really having a true antagonist, though he's not really the cause of every problem on the book, and he certainly isn't seen in all the chapters. At this point, I'm going to discuss a tiny bit of a spoiler, but I wouldn't think it's something that will ruin your enjoyment of this story. In fact, I'd highly recommend you watch this part, because I think it'll heavily factor into whether you like this story or not. So you see, Von Rumpel has more than one reason to be searching after the Sea of Flames. See, he has cancer, and he seems to have a bit of belief in the supposed supernatural powers of the Sea of Flames. This belief that the diamond may somehow cure him of his cancer is an explanation as to the desperate measures and sometimes extreme methods he uses to search for the jewel. Now, there's a lot of symbolic purpose to the Sea of Flames, Von Rumpel's belief in it, and Marie-Laure's association with it. But to discuss that would, I think, get into spoiler territory that I'm not willing to go. Instead, I want to discuss the problem with the Sea of Flame. Amongst all the reviews I have read and watched, most of the negative ones and even some of the positive ones state that the Sea of Flames is a bad part of the story. Now, this isn't what I believe, but I do understand why people found it to be jarring. For the most part, All the Light is a grounded book. It's about a very real war. It references real events and places, and the characters are grounded in reality. But for many, the Sea of Flames is too Indiana Jones-esque, a discombobulating departure from the otherwise realistic story. And this seems to throw people away, breaking the realm of believability. Now, I would argue that this is not entirely correct. I don't think Dorr, the author, ever directly says or presents any definitive confirmation that the Sea of Flames is truly supernatural. Sure, events surrounding it and the characters that interact with it could be interpreted as evidence that there is validity to the superstition. But as with real cursed objects, all of it can be chalked up to a combination of coincidence and a placebo effect. Perhaps Dorr pushed the idea too far, or maybe the coincidences were too numerous, but for me, I really don't see the problem with the Sea of Flames. The second problem people seem to have with it is the intense belief Von Rumpel has in its healing powers. Why would a fully grown adult be so superstitious? But is it really that difficult to believe? Just think about all the different beliefs that people have. Even if we only consider major religions, there are numerous people who believe in things that they cannot see and have no evidence for. And on top of that, think about Von Rumpel's predicament. When someone has a disease that is almost certainly to kill them, when doctors say that they have little chance, why wouldn't they cling to any hope, superstitious though it may be? I'm not saying Von Rumpel is ever in the right here, but I don't believe it's beyond the realm of possibility that they would seek the diamond so desperately. A hope, even if it's a small one, is still a hope. But there is a bigger reason I enjoy the Sea of Flames plot. And it's also the other reason I believe the book can appeal to non-readers. It provides an escapist element to an otherwise thought-provoking and sometimes depressing novel. Every time Von Rumpel came into the story, or the Sea of Flames was mentioned, I felt like I could take a break from thinking for a while. And instead, I could enjoy the story as if it were an adventure. Personally, I loved the fact that All the Light had what I believe was a perfect balance between serious and beautiful prose and elements of action-adventure. For many, this came across as jarring, but I think these are only the vocal ones. I believe that for someone who doesn't read much, or someone who only reads books for escapism, The Sea of Flames, in combination with the aforementioned short chapters, is a perfect way to keep them from getting bored during the reading, while also learning just a little bit. Let's delve more into the plot and characters of All the Light. So, first, the timeline. This is a story about World War II. Specifically, it takes place really from the very beginning of Hitler's reign up until the 1944 liberation of Paris. This is when the Allied forces defeated German fighters who had occupation of much of France at the time. The book has parts which intermittently switch between a timeline in which our characters are growing up and one in which our characters are experiencing the liberation of Paris. Now, I'm not a historian, so I don't feel qualified to talk about the history of this invasion, but I will link some sites that discuss it, as well as some that talk about the true history behind the fiction displayed in All the Light. These links will be in the description. Now, for the characters. First, we have Marie-Laure Leblanc. Marie-Laure is a Parisian girl who goes blind at the age of 6. There is some lore centered around this event. It could be argued that the book insinuates the Sea of Flames has something to do with it, but as I discussed, this is up to the reader. My point is that she's blind and she has a father who very much loves her. She's 12 years old when the Nazis occupy France, and she and her father escape to a little seaside village known as St. Malo. This, by the way, is a real place. I hear it's actually quite beautiful. I'm also going to link a blog which discusses the real-life locations depicted in this book. Nevertheless, Marie-Laure and her father escape there, where they live with her eccentric uncle, a man who fought in World War I and has some pretty severe PTSD from it. So, that's a setup for Marie-Laure. But the other protagonist is perhaps a little more interesting. His name is Werner Pfennig, and he's a German boy with extremely Aryan qualities. This is important because, as it turns out, Werner is enlisted into the Nazi army. Now, right away, you might be thinking, how is this Nazi possibly a protagonist? Well, the fact is that Werner is a complicated character. This, by the way, is where I feel I need to give a disclaimer. What I'm about to say is in no way, shape, or form sympathizing with Nazis or Nazism. This is a despicable worldview, and one that really has no justifications. But not only is Werner a child when the Nazis come into power, but he's given very little choice in the matter, and he has doubts along the way. Long story short, Werner is fighting for the Nazis, but I wouldn't really call him a Nazi. At least, he doesn't have the worldview that Nazis are associated with. Anyways, Werner is an orphan living in a small mining town known as Sovereign. His father was a miner who perished in an accident, something that was apparently quite common at the time. As such, his employment opportunities are limited. In fact, really, the only thing he can viably do is follow in his father's footsteps, something that would likely result in an early death. So when Werner starts to show a knack for electronics, and specifically radios, he is eventually recruited into the Nazi army. Specifically, his job is to use his knowledge and talent in math and science to locate the source of illegal radios. Why? Well, radios were, at the time, used as a method of communication between anyone who may want to rebel, something Nazis obviously would have wanted to avoid. Now, these two paths, Werner and Marie-Laure, eventually cross. though I will admit that it may not be as satisfying as some readers may want. I hope that isn't too much of a spoiler, but I've heard some people complain about it, and I think it's an important warning. I won't reveal how they meet or what happens after they do, but it's brief, and it takes a while to happen. Alright, here's where I want to discuss the characters in a little bit more detail. First, I want to discuss Ferner. Now, because of Ferner's status as a literal child, and his grim future as a minor, as well as the fact that the majority of media Ferner consumes in his childhood is Nazi propaganda, it is at least more understandable that he falls into the trap of joining the regime. It's also worth noting that the book makes it clear that he doesn't think in the same way that many of his peers do. When some of the older boys are enlisted in Hitler Youth, they come back with a great pride and a lot of racism. Ferner, however, does not. It's also important, though, that Ferner is not a symbol of the fight against racism. He's not overtly racist, but it is clear that the propaganda works to a certain extent. He does fight for the Nazis. His sister Yuda is really his guilty conscience. I haven't talked about Yuda yet, but she's younger than him by 2 years, and she's absolutely not eating up Nazi ideology. Throughout the book, she consistently comments about the evils of the Nazi regime, and she grows visibly angry against her brother for even considering joining the party. This is something I've heard some readers complain about, in that it was unrealistic for her to be a good soul, especially considering that she is younger than him and thus would have been exposed to propaganda at an even younger age. Now, perhaps it is unrealistic, but I personally don't think it matters. Yuda is a symbol more than anything. Now, here is where I want to bring the real world into this. At the time of writing this script, the Western world is going through a major change. We're finally beginning to see the systemic racism and inhumanity of the society we've built. Here in my country of Canada, the finding of hundreds of unmarked graves belonging to the indigenous lives that the white man attempted to snuff out. I think it's important to add that that number is no longer in the hundreds. It is now in the thousands, and it is increasing, to the point where I don't even feel comfortable naming a number, because tomorrow it could very likely be higher. This is a travesty, and it cannot be ignored. Because I have not been directly affected by any of these things, it is not my right to discuss them. It's just not my story to tell. But it is important that you are educated about them. So please do your research. Listen to the voices of those who are hurt, and I will have some sites linked where you can begin. I think there are 3 different ways to deal with the revelation about injustice. One is denial, or even agreement with the wrong side. There are people who either claim that racism doesn't exist, or are openly racist themselves. This is unacceptable, and it is the view of many of the minor German characters within this story. The other extreme is that of Yuda, someone who not only is against the injustice, but openly fights against it. Yuda is in constant conflict with Ferner, frequently telling him that he is in the wrong. Yuda, to me, represents the protesters of today. Those people who see something wrong and speak about it. They don't stay quiet. Then there is Ferner. Ferner, to me, represents what I believe to be the majority of us. Unfortunately, many people, even knowing that these injustices exist, don't do anything about it, and often even inactively partake in it. Think a store owner who subconsciously watches visible minorities more closely than others. Sometimes this does happen consciously, but I think often it's a subconscious thing. Think about someone who says, well, residential schools were bad, but they were in the past. Newsflash, by the way. They were not that far in the past. The last residential school closed in 1997. That's the year I was born. So it's not really something we can or should forget anytime soon. But I don't think the people who say that are necessarily irredeemable. They're not evil. Instead, they are just ignorant. I don't mean that in a cruel sense. I just literally mean that they really don't understand the extent of the evils. If they did, and they still chose to ignore them, then they are irredeemable. This is why I think research and education is so very important. Let's bring the title of the novel into it. With racism and injustice in mind, what could the light represent? Well, here, while Marie-Laura is literally blind, Ferner is metaphorically blind. He cannot see the light. He can't see the evil that he's partaking in. Now, without giving too much away, he slowly begins to see the light, and it is clear that he struggles with his conscience once he does. So, in that sense, the title is telling us to search for that light we cannot see. Because we can't see it, we might not even know what to search for. So instead, I think it's just telling us to be aware that there is a light we cannot see. This way, when we do glimpse quick flashes of that light, or are provided with a candle, we know enough to recognize it. So I'm going to leave this section with one more reminder. Look for the light. Listen to the stories of those who are hurting, because recognizing the problem is the first step to fixing it. At this point, you might be expecting me to zoom in a little bit more on Marie-Laura. To be honest, I've been avoiding talking about her. One of the reviewers I watched in preparation for this video said that they found Marie-Laura to be an uninteresting character as opposed to the much more complicated Ferner. I believe they even referred to her as a flat character. At the time, I thought, nah, I disagree. However, upon further inspection, I do find that I have way more to say about Ferner than I do about Marie-Laura. So perhaps they were onto something. This isn't to say that Marie-Laura is not an important character, or that there is not a lot to analyze about her. The way she gets around the city despite her blindness, her association with the Sea of Flames, and her fascination with muscles, the sea creature, not the big guns, are all things that are ripe for analysis, as well as her interest in radio, something that connects back to Ferner as well. But I don't really want to talk about these things for the video, both because I think I'd have to reveal spoilers to delve into them, and also because, honestly, I'm just not as interested in this aspect of the book as I am in others. Also, if I did go into it, I'd probably rant even more than I already am. And that's the thing about All the Light. I may be a bit more interested in Ferner as a character than I was with Marie-Laura, but this may not be the same for everyone. I think that everybody who reads this book will likely gain something from it, but it won't be the same as what I did. This is also why I have thus far committed a carnal sin for English teachers everywhere. I've not used any direct quotes from the novel. Don't get me wrong. There are some beautiful quotes in this book. Quotes that have stuck with me for a long time. Many of these quotes actually come from Marie-Laura's side of things. Quotes such as, "Don't you want to live before you die?" Or a take on the classic story of a frog slowly boiling in water. I love these quotes, and I could easily read them and talk about what they mean to me for a few minutes, but something that means a lot to me may not mean anything to you. And alternatively, something that you loved may be quite forgettable to me. Ultimately, I want you to experience this book for yourself. If I gave away this beautiful prose before you had a chance to read it yourself, I think I'd be robbing you of some of the experiences. That being said, there is one quote that I want to read from to close. This is because this quote, above all else, is what made All the Light resonate with me so much. Now, this quote is from the very end of the novel. In fact, it's like in the second to last page. That being said, I still don't want to spoil anything. So I'm going to omit names and certain elements of the quote in order to leave only the deeper meaning of it. For that reason, I really don't think this will be a spoiler. But given that it takes place at the very end of the novel, I think it's only fair to warn you anyways. Alright, here we go. People walk the paths of the gardens below, and the wind sings anthems in the hedges, and the big old cedars at the entrance to the maze creak imagines the electromagnetic waves traveling into and out of Mikhail's machine, bending around them, just as used to describe, except now 1,000 times more crisscross the air than when he lived, maybe 1,000,000 times more. Torrents of text conversations, tides of cell conversations, of television programs, of email, vast networks of fiber and wire interlaced above and beneath the city, passing through buildings, arcing between transmitters and metro tunnels, between antennas atop buildings, from lampposts with cellular transmitters in them, commercials for Carrefour and Evian, and pre-baked toaster pastries flashing into space and back to Earth again. I'm going to be late, and maybe we should get reservations, and pick up avocados, and what did he say? And 10,000 I miss yous, 50,000 I love yous, hate mail and appointment reminders and market updates, jewelry ads, coffee ads, furniture ads, flying invisibly over the warrens of Paris, over the battlefields and tombs, over the Ardennes, over the Rhine, over Belgium and Denmark, over the scarred and ever-shifting landscapes we call nations. And is it so hard to believe that souls might travel these paths? They might harry the sky in flocks like egrets, like terns, like starlings. That great shuttles of souls might fly above, faded but audible if you listen closely enough. They flow above the chimneys, ride the sidewalks, slip through your jacket and shirt and breastbone and lungs, and pass out through the other side, the air, a library, and the record of every life lived, every sentence spoken, every word transmitted, still reverberating within it. Every hour, she thinks, someone for whom the war was memory falls out of the world. We rise again in the grass, in the flowers, in songs. At the time of reading this, I was going through a great deal of loss. I'd lost my grandmother, who I loved very much. I had lost my dreams for a career, which I had dreamed of for almost 5 years. At the same time, I felt like I had lost many of my friends, people I had drifted apart from and people who had moved away. Much more recently, I lost my dog, Maggie, my companion since the age of 10. But reading this excerpt, I remember I didn't really lose my grandmother. She's there when I play a game of solitaire. We used to have competitions to see who could win the game first. She's there when I look at my bookshelf and see all the books I read to her, or the ones she bought for me at a used bookstore. She's there when I eat gummy bears or pistachios, and she's there when I look at my mom and see a bit of her in there. And I didn't lose my career. It just changed. It didn't close any doors for me, but it opened up new ones. It gave me the motivation and the courage to try new things, things I hadn't even thought of before. And I didn't lose my dog. She's there when I walk in the grass that she used to love to eat. She's there when I see old dog hairs in the corner of the room somewhere. She's there at night when I dream of her. My point is that the people and things I have lost are not really lost. They are there in different forms, sometimes even invisible forms. Sometimes the truth is we cannot see it, but it is there. We just have to search for it. So I want to leave this video with one final message. All of us have experienced loss. And the older you get, the more loss you experience. But instead of thinking about loss, think about the invisible light that is used to replace the loss. It may be difficult to see. It may even be impossible to see. But it's there, and you might just be able to find it. So look for it, and finally find the light that we cannot see. Well, that was a long one. So if you made it all the way through, thank you so much. Please let me know what you think of it in the comments below. I could really use all the feedback that I can get. Next time, I'm going to be discussing a bit of a different book. It's actually going to be one that I definitely don't respect as much, and I don't think is very good, but I can't help but enjoy anyways. So look forward to that sometime in the future. But with that, thank you for watching, and I hope you guys are doing